The palace guards drew their swords the moment the blind vampire lord grabbed his new servant's throat, because for the first time in 300 years, he couldn't hear a heartbeat. His fingers pressed against the soft skin of her neck, gently, then with more pressure. His pale silver eyes, forever sealed behind that black silk mask, tilted slightly toward the ceiling as he listened. Silence. Not the silence of a room gone still. Not the silence of held breath. But a deep, impossible, suffocating silence. The kind that does not exist inside a living body. "What are you?" he whispered. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She simply stood with her eyes lowered and her hands folded at her waist, as though a 300-year-old vampire lord did not currently have his hand wrapped around her throat. "Your new servant, my lord," she said. "Sent from the eastern quarters. My name is Clara." The guards exchanged glances. Their hands tightened on the hilts of their swords. Every one of them had seen Lord Alistair snap the necks of assassins who dared step within 3 feet of him without announcement. Every one of them had watched him name traitors by heartbeat alone, pulling them from court gatherings before a single word of conspiracy had been spoken aloud. But right now, his face wore an expression none of them had ever seen before. He looked uncertain. Lord Alistair released her throat slowly. He stepped back 1 measured pace. His head turned left, then right, as though listening for something hiding just beyond the edge of sound. "Leave us," he said. "My lord," the head guard began. "Leave us." The doors closed, and in the silence of that enormous throne chamber, lit by 1,000 black candles, hung with tapestries the color of dried blood, the most feared ruler in the vampire kingdom stood facing a human girl he could not read. And something ancient and terrifying flickered behind that silk mask. Curiosity. Before we continue, if you love stories like this, subscribe right now and leave a like. Drop a comment telling us you're watching in 2026. We read every single one. Clara had planned for many things. She had planned for the cold. The palace sat above a mountain ridge where summer never fully arrived, and she'd sewn warming strips of wool into the lining of her servant's uniform. She had planned for the scrutiny. Lord Alistair's court was notorious for examining new staff through supernatural senses before a single shift was worked. She had spent 6 weeks learning to suppress her aura completely before she ever set foot on the road to the palace. No heartbeat, no scent, no body heat, no fear. What she had not planned for was how tall he was. She'd seen illustrations, of course. Propaganda woodcuts spread by the kingdom's human resistance showed Lord Alistair as a hunched figure in black, hollow-cheeked and cruel. The reality was something different. He stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, built like something that had been carved rather than born, dressed impeccably in deep charcoal and silver, with long pale hands that moved with the kind of careful economy that told you every gesture was deliberate. His hair was the color of midnight frost. His face, what she could see beneath the black silk mask, was aggressively, almost offensively handsome. He had been 28 when he was turned. He had looked 28 for 3 centuries. She found herself hating that. "You will serve me directly," Lord Alistair said. He had not moved from the center of the room. His blind eyes pointed not quite at her face, angled just slightly to her left, the way a person listens rather than looks. "My former attendant retired last season. I require someone who can navigate the palace without noise, relay written correspondence aloud since I cannot read it myself, and guide me through the private corridors at night without supervision from the guard." "I understand, my lord. You will walk 2 steps ahead of me. You will never touch me without speaking first. You will never lie to me." A pause. "I will know if you do." Clara kept her eyes down. "Of course, my lord." He tilted his head again. That listening posture. She'd read about it in her mother's journals. Lord Alistair's supernatural hearing could detect the microscopic elevation of a human heartbeat that accompanied deception. He'd named 47 traitors in his court over 3 centuries without a shred of physical evidence. Simply by listening. She felt nothing when he listened to her. That was the entire point. But she noticed the slight furrow between his brows when the silence continued to yield nothing. She noticed the way his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, as though he were pressing on a sore tooth. She stored that observation carefully. She was very good at storing observations. "You may begin tomorrow," he said finally. "The housekeeper will show you your quarters." "Thank you, my lord." She turned to leave. "Clara." She stopped. "How did you come to be assigned to my service?" he asked. His voice was absolutely neutral. "The Eastern Quarters typically supplies kitchen staff." She'd prepared for this question too. "The kitchen mistress said you'd requested someone quiet, my lord." She said I was the quietest person she'd ever employed. A long silence, and then, impossibly, Lord Alistair almost smiled. "She was not wrong," he said. The eastern wing of the palace was 3 days' walk from the location of the relic. Clara knew this because she had memorized every map she could find, cross-referenced against her mother's written accounts of the night the palace was raided. The night Clara was 4 years old and hidden inside a cedar chest while her parents died trying to protect what they called the Heartstone. The Heartstone was, by her mother's description, a small obsidian disc the size of a pocket watch, etched with the seal of Clara's bloodline. It had been in their family for 9 generations. It was the reason their bloodline had developed aura suppression in the first place. A gift, her grandmother had called it, from the old magic sealed inside the stone. A protection. A legacy. Lord Alistair's clan had taken it the same night they'd taken everything else. She gave herself 6 weeks to find it, steal it, and disappear. She did not give herself permission to feel anything until she was gone. Before we continue, we'd like to take a moment to wish a very happy birthday to our amazing scriptwriter, Joy, who is celebrating her birthday on June 27th. Joy, thank you for everything you do to bring these stories to life. We wish you happiness, good health, and so many more wonderful years ahead. And to everyone watching, if you'd like us to celebrate your birthday, your wedding anniversary, or another special occasion in an upcoming video, leave your first name and the date in the comments. You might hear your name in one of our next stories. Working directly for Lord Alistair was unlike anything Clara had anticipated. She had expected brutality. She had expected cold commands and punishments for minor failures. She had been told, by everyone in the Resistance Network who'd briefed her, that the blind vampire lord was a tyrant who ruled through terror and eliminated any human who displayed the slightest trace of independent thought. What she found instead was someone almost crushingly meticulous. He expected excellence, yes, but he explained what he wanted with precise and almost exhausting clarity, leaving nothing ambiguous. He did not shout. He did not threaten. When she made a small error on her second day, mispronouncing the name of a visiting noble from the Northern Territories, he corrected her quietly, without audience, and did not mention it again. What unsettled her more than anything was the way he moved with her. Because he was blind, and because he had spent 3 centuries navigating the palace through supernatural perception. Heartbeats, footsteps, breath, vibration. Her absolute silence threw him completely. He couldn't track her. On the 3rd morning, she was standing 3 feet to his left reading correspondence aloud when he reached out without warning and his hand closed around her wrist. Not violently, more the way a man grabs a railing when the floor shifts unexpectedly beneath him. "You moved," he said. "I stepped slightly left to catch the light, my lord. I apologize. Give me your wrist." She placed her wrist in his hand without argument. His fingers pressed against the underside of it, over her pulse point, and she felt the particular quality of his attention shift, like a radio dial turning, hunting for a signal. Silence. His grip tightened fractionally. Not painful. Something else. Something she didn't have a word for. "You may continue reading," he said. He did not release her wrist. She continued reading. He stood beside her for the rest of that correspondence session with his fingers wrapped loosely around her wrist, like a man holding a compass that refused to point north, still somehow unwilling to set it down. By the end of the first week, Clara had catalogued the following. The Heartstone was not in the Eastern Treasury as her mother's journals suggested. It had been moved. She could tell by the way the Treasury's shelf dust had been disturbed in a deliberate pattern, the sign of something relocated rather than simply taken. There were two other possible locations: the Lord's private study, or the vault beneath the observatory, which required a key worn constantly on Lord Alastair's person. She needed more time inside his private spaces. By the end of the second week, she had something she had not anticipated needing. She was beginning to look forward to the mornings. She told herself it was tactical. She was close to him. She was learning the patterns of the palace. She was building the kind of invisible trust that would eventually grant her access to the private study. She told herself this very firmly at 5 in the morning when she was already awake and already thinking about the way he'd said her name the previous afternoon. Low and without ceremony, the way people say names they have been turning over in their minds. Clara. She pressed her forehead to the cold stone wall of her quarters and reminded herself that her parents had died. She reminded herself of the cedar chest. She reminded herself of the sound. She was 4 years old and she still remembered the sound of her mother's voice going silent on the other side of the wood. She stopped looking forward to the mornings. For about 3 days. "Read that section again," Lord Alastair said. They were in the private study. She had gained access by simply being assigned there. He'd requested she inventory the written correspondence backlog that his previous attendant had allowed to accumulate. The room was floor to ceiling in dark bookshelves, lit by firelight, smelling of beeswax and old paper and something underneath that she was trying very hard not to identify as specifically, individually him. She read the section again. A trade agreement with the Northern Wolf clans. Dry and administrative. "Stop." She stopped. "There's an error in the third clause," he said. "Read it once more, slowly." She read it slowly. She found the error on the second pass. A conflicting date that would create a loophole favoring the Northern clan in any future dispute. "I see it," she said. The delivery date in Clause 3 conflicts with the exclusivity window in Clause 7. Whoever drafted this either made a mistake or drafted it intentionally, Lord Alastair said. Yes. He was standing at the window, his back to her. It was the first time she'd seen him turn his back to anyone inside this palace, and she understood suddenly that it was because he normally didn't need to face anyone. His senses did that work for him. With her, his senses were useless. He turned to the window the way a sighted person might. "Who delivered this?" he asked. "Lord Vance's seal, my lord." A silence that had edges to it. "Lord Vance," he repeated. "Yes, my lord." Another silence. Then Clara. "How long have you been a servant?" The shift in subject was sharp enough that she almost stumbled over it. 7 years, my lord. In various households. "And before that?" "My parents were farmers. Both dead." "Yes." "How?" She kept her voice exactly level. "Fever, my lord. When I was young." She felt him listening. Felt that deep, radio dial searching quality in the air. Finding nothing. Always finding nothing. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were so quiet she almost didn't catch them. "My lord. For your loss. Losing parents young." He paused. "It leaves a particular kind of silence." Clara looked at the back of his head. At the way his shoulders had shifted when he said it. Something releasing. Something he hadn't meant to say. "Yes," she said carefully. "It does." The first time she found him in the North Corridor alone, she understood what vulnerability looked like on a monster. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, perfectly still, his head slightly tilted. She'd come around the corner unexpectedly, after hours, carrying a lamp for her own navigation. He hadn't heard her approach. He didn't know she was there. And for a moment, before she could decide what to do, she watched Lord Alistair, blind vampire lord, ruler of the kingdom, reach out and find the wall with one careful hand, then begin to navigate by touch alone through the corridor he had ruled for 3 centuries. Because all of his servants had heartbeats, he had always known, without thinking, exactly where everyone in this palace was, except her. And now she was standing 6 feet away watching him count doorframes with his fingertips like a man feeling his way through darkness that had always, only before, been inside him. She should have stayed silent. She should have let him pass. She should have done any of the 100 things that were strategically sensible. Instead she said, quietly, "My lord, I'm here, 6 feet ahead, slightly to your left." He went completely still. When he turned toward her voice, his expression was, she didn't have a word for it. Something between fury and relief in a ratio she couldn't calculate. "You should be in your quarters," he said. "I couldn't sleep. I apologize." He crossed the distance between them, stopped 2 feet away, reached out, and this time his hand found her shoulder. Then traveled up, deliberate and unhurried, until his fingers rested lightly against the side of her throat. Listening. Silence. 3 weeks, he said. "You've been here 3 weeks and I still cannot hear you." "I know, my lord. It's not possible. I have heard heartbeats through stone walls. I have heard the pulse of a man lying still in a coffin." His thumb pressed very gently, just below her jaw. "What are you, Clara?" She held his gaze, or as close to his gaze as those unseeing eyes allowed, and said nothing. "Whatever you are," he said softly, "I find I don't want you to leave." It was, she would think later, the most dangerous thing he could possibly have said. If you were in Clara's position right now, trapped between revenge and something you didn't plan to feel, what would you do? Tell us in the comments before we continue. I want to know. She found the Heartstone at the end of the 4th week. It was in the private study after all. Not on the shelves, but inside the base of the fireplace, behind a false stone that had been mortared in sometime in the last decade. She found it while cataloging the room for the 3rd time, when she noticed that the soot pattern on that particular stone was wrong. Mortar darkens from the outside in. This one had darkened from the inside out. She pressed the stone, turned, and behind it, resting in a velvet-lined hollow, was an obsidian disc the size of her palm, etched with the seal of her bloodline, warm to the touch even after decades of cold storage. She closed her hand around it. Her mother's face came to her, clear and sudden and more vivid than it had been in years. Dark eyes, a laugh like water over stones, the smell of the cedar chest and the wool blanket she'd been wrapped in, and her mother's voice saying, "Stay quiet, darling, stay so quiet." Clara stood in the firelight and cried without making a sound. She had spent 6 weeks training herself out of exactly this collapse of composure at the worst possible moment, and it happened anyway. She was 22 years old, and she had not cried for her parents since she was 7, because crying felt like a luxury for people who weren't planning revenge. She pressed the stone against her chest, and then she put it back. Not forever. She told herself not forever. She needed 3 more days to chart the exit routes before she could safely disappear. She couldn't run with the stone tonight and expect to survive the mountain pass without a proper plan. She mortared the false stone back into place. She went to bed. She told herself she would leave in 3 days. It was Lord Vance who told her the truth, though he didn't mean to. She had been delivering written correspondence to the northern reception chamber when she'd heard voices on the other side of the adjoining wall. She recognized Lord Vance immediately. She'd been reading his correspondence aloud for a month. The second voice was younger. One of the junior noble houses, she thought. "The servant girl," Lord Vance said. "The new one. The quiet one. What about her? She's been there almost 5 weeks. She's closer to him than any human should be. He lets her into the study. He took his evening meal with her present last week. Pause. If she has any useful information about the vault, I want it. You think she'd help us? I think she's human. I think humans can always be motivated. His voice dropped. After all, her family wasn't killed by Lord Alistair. They were killed by the men I hired. She just doesn't know that yet. Clara stood very still against the cold stone wall. The passage she'd heard next became blurred, because something was happening to her hearing. A rushing sound, like blood pressure dropping. She made herself breathe, made herself continue listening. And what she heard, over the next 6 minutes, dismantled every architecture of purpose she had spent the last 2 years constructing. The raid on her family's household. The men hired through Lord Vance's network. The Heartstone taken and delivered to the palace specifically so that Alistair would be blamed. The slow-acting curse embedded in the stone's removal, a trap designed not for Clara's family but for Lord Alistair. If the stone was ever taken from the palace, the curse would activate. And Lord Vance had been waiting for years for someone with sufficient motive to walk inside and take it for him. Someone, she realized with a sickness rising in her chest, exactly like her. She didn't go to Lord Alistair that night. She sat in her quarters and worked through the timeline methodically, the way her mother had taught her. When you're angry, you count first, you speak second, you act third. Lord Alistair's clan had been in the area. That part was true. There had been territorial violence in those years, that part was also true. But the specific raid, the specific men, the specific night, Lord Vance. She thought about the trade agreement with the conflicting clause. She thought about the name on the seal. She thought about Lord Alistair standing at the window saying, "I'm sorry for your loss." She went to Lord Alistair at midnight. He was in the study. "My lord," she said, "I need to tell you something." He turned from the window immediately. "Clara." "Lord Vance," she said. "He's planning a move against you. He's been using me. My presence here as part of it." A silence. "Explain." She told him everything she'd heard through the wall. She told him about the Heartstone, about the curse. She did not tell him she'd found it. She did not tell him about her family, or why she'd come, or what she'd been planning to do. When she finished, the silence in the room was the longest she'd sat with. "You knew about the Heartstone," Lord Alistair said. His voice was entirely neutral. "Before tonight." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "You found it." "Yes." "And you didn't take it." "No." He turned to face her fully, and she saw something cross his face, swift and gone, like a bird crossing a window, that she couldn't name. It looked almost like wonder. "Why?" he asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. "Because the story I was told wasn't true," she said finally. "And I needed to understand the real one before I made an irreversible decision." What followed was not a confession so much as an excavation. Lord Alistair told her about the Heartstone, how it had been brought to the palace not as a trophy but because his court scholar had warned that it was too dangerous to leave unguarded in a human household. How he'd never understood why it had been created or who it had belonged to. How it had simply been here when he arrived and here it had remained. He told her about the raid, what he knew of it. Territorial clashes. A night he was in the Northern Territories entirely. An aftermath he'd returned to and found confusing in its specificity. How it had always bothered him that a single farmstead had been so precisely targeted. He told her, in a voice that was very controlled, about the woman who had blinded him 3 centuries ago. How he had loved her completely and trusted her with the knowledge of his one vulnerability. How she had used that knowledge anyway. "I hear heartbeats," he said, "because I cannot trust faces. I cannot see faces. What I learned to trust was sound, the involuntary sound of truth." He paused. "And then you arrived." Clara looked at him. "I heard nothing," he continued. "For 4 weeks, nothing. and I found myself in the extraordinary position of having to decide whether to trust someone I could not verify. He turned slightly toward the fire. I decided to trust you anyway. That was dangerous, she said. Yes. He almost smiled. It was. I found I didn't mind. The next 72 hours moved fast. Lord Vance's move came earlier than expected. 2 nights later, when Clara woke to the sound of boots on stone and found 3 of Lord Vance's household guard in the corridor outside her door. They were there to take her, not kill her. Vance wanted her aura suppression ability for himself, wanted her to carry the Heartstone out of the palace and trigger the curse while he stood safely in the Northern Territories. Lord Alistair was in the throne chamber when they came. He had no warning, no heartbeat approaching, no irregular sound. The first guard reached him before anyone could call out. Clara reached the throne chamber because she ran. She burst through the doors in time to see Lord Alistair. Alone, no guard, relying on supernatural hearing that was buying him half a second at best against 3 trained fighters who knew not to make unnecessary noise. Holding his ground by sheer centuries earned instinct. He was fast. He was dangerously fast. But he was also bleeding from a silver-edged blade along his left arm, and a second guard was circling behind him that he couldn't hear coming. She shouted his name. He spun. The guard behind him missed. It was enough. Lord Vance was arrested before dawn. Lord Alistair stood in the center of the throne chamber afterward, his arm bandaged, blood still on his clothes, and said to Clara, "You could leave now, with the stone. I know. The curse would kill me slowly. It would look like natural deterioration. No one would connect it to you. I know. Your family would be avenged. In a sense. My family was killed by Lord Vance," she said. "Not by you. Avenging them by killing you would be solving the wrong equation." He said nothing for a long moment. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to know that your answer changes nothing about what I'm about to say." She waited. "When you first arrived," he said carefully, "I thought I heard something. Not a heartbeat, something else. A rhythm. Faint. Inconsistent. Almost like..." He stopped. "Like an echo of a heartbeat I knew once. Long ago." Clara felt something very still settle through her. "I said nothing," he continued, "because I thought I was simply remembering. Grief can do that. Press old sounds into new silence." His blind eyes found her face with an accuracy that still unnerved her. "I don't know what it means. I don't know if it means anything. But I wanted you to know that the silence was never complete. There was always something." "What do you want me to say?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," he said. "I only wanted you to know. What do you think happens next? Drop your prediction in the comments right now before I tell you. I want to see who gets it right." Clara left the palace on a morning in late autumn. She took nothing but her traveling clothes, her mother's journal, which she'd carried in with her, and the memory of 6 weeks that had rearranged everything she thought she understood about hate. She did not take the Heartstone. She stood in front of the false stone in the fireplace for a long time. She pressed her fingers against it. She thought about her parents. She thought about the cedar chest and the wool blanket and the voice that had said, "Stay quiet, darling." She thought about Lord Alistair standing in the north corridor counting door frames with his fingertips. She left the stone where it was. She told herself it was pragmatism. Removing it was still dangerous, still potentially triggering, still technically the last favor Lord Vance had been counting on her to perform. She told herself she would make other arrangements for her family's legacy. She told herself the stone belonged in the palace anyway, in its velvet-lined hollow, sealed behind its false stone, keeping a 300-year-old vampire alive without his knowing it. She told herself many things on the mountain road that morning. She believed most of them. The years that followed were quieter than she'd expected. She went back to the network she'd trained with and found that she no longer fit inside their framework. Their certainty about who was a monster and who wasn't had lost something in translation somewhere on the palace road. She did other work. Quieter work. work that required her specific skill of appearing to be nobody in particular. She heard stories about Lord Alistair's court the way travelers hear stories, passing through, fragmentary, secondhand. That the vampire lord had become unexpectedly moderate in his dealings with the human settlements along the kingdom's borders. That he had dismantled 3 punitive tribute arrangements in the same year. That he held court twice a month in the Eastern Hall and required no supernatural verification from any human petitioner who came to him with a complaint. That he still wore the black silk mask. That he had never remarried. 7 years after Clara walked out of the palace gates, a traveler passing through the Eastern Territories stopped at a mountain inn and found himself in conversation with a palace steward taking a short leave. "Strange place to work," the traveler said. "After everything they say about the Lord there." The steward shrugged. "He's not what they say. No. Strange, maybe. Particular. He has rules that don't make sense from outside." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Like the East Gate. What about it?" "He insists it be left unlocked. Every night. Winter included." The guards thought it was a mistake the first year, but it's been 7 years running, and he's replaced 2 head guards who tried to lock it. The traveler frowned. "Why? That's a security risk." The steward shook her head slowly. "No one inside the palace would tell you this officially. But the general understanding is..." She lowered her voice slightly. "He's waiting for someone. After 7 years?" She looked at the traveler with the particular expression of someone who has been employed in a palace long enough to understand what 3 centuries does to a person's sense of time. "After 7 years," she said. Still, the last light over the eastern mountains looked like the edge of something about to begin. Clara stood at the base of the mountain road, her traveling pack over one shoulder, looking up at the palace walls illuminated in amber and rose. She'd been 4 days on the road. She'd told herself she was passing through. She'd told herself she had business in the Northern Territories, and this was simply the most direct route. She was, she reflected, a much less convincing liar than she'd been 7 years ago. The East Gate stood open. It had, apparently, been standing open every night for 7 years. She stood at the bottom of the mountain road for a very long time. Then she picked up her pack and started climbing. Some called it love. Some called it obsession. Perhaps the most dangerous relationships are the ones where no one can agree which is which. Because the truth is this: Lord Alistair never asked Clara to come back. He only left the door open. And Clara never promised to return. She only stopped walking away. What lives between those two things, between an unlocked gate and a woman climbing a mountain road at dusk, has no clean name. It isn't the love from stories where everything is simple. It isn't obsession in the way that word is meant to warn you. It's the thing that happens when 2 people who should have been enemies spend 6 weeks telling the truth to each other in the dark. When a man used to reading the whole world through sound meets the one person who is silence to him, and chooses to trust her anyway. When a woman built entirely for revenge arrives at the moment she's been planning toward for 20 years and finds that the story was wrong, and that the man she came to destroy was counting door frames in an empty corridor trying to find his way. Maybe Clara was right to leave. Maybe she should have stayed. Maybe the ending was the East Gate and the mountain road and the dusk light that made everything look like a beginning. Some things don't resolve. Some things just continue. That, perhaps, is what makes them worth telling. And that is the end of tonight's story. If this one got under your skin, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments. Who was your favorite character? Was it love or obsession for you? And did Clara make the right choice leaving the Heartstone behind? Share this with someone who loves a dark romance that doesn't tie itself up too neatly. We'll see you in the next one.